So sure, I get the implementation of this for the sake of novel exercises and doing something a bit different and a bit new, but I don't think you need to. So we're back in business and we're back in front of the old camera, and we're talking about MadFit today. So I haven't actually looked at any home workout creators for a while, and this one tickled my pickle because we're looking at a toned legs and round booty at home workout. But the big thing is no equipment. And the reason why I want to go through this is because essentially I want to talk about some of the limitations of no equipment workouts and how you could maybe alter them to potentially make them a little bit better for your goals. So MadFit is someone I've covered on the channel a few times, but not extensively. In all honesty, there have been a few occasions where I've not been particularly impressed with what I've seen. Don't get me wrong, she has certainly done some things that I have been impressed with, but there have also been a few things that kind of didn't really appeal to me. And essentially, when you're doing any kind of like leg or booty based workout at home, realistically, I would expect to see a fair number of squat variations, because ultimately the squats do work the quads effectively. The squats do also work the glutes pretty effectively too. Limiting factor there is you're not getting any hamstring work, but you could try and get that elsewhere, which is going to be a bit harder with no equipment, but we'll explain that later. I'm going to spend less time analysing her technique and stuff, and more time speaking about limitations and, like I said, how to make it more effective. So when you're kind of looking at doing a squat variation or similar to help you better target the glutes, ideally we don't really need to go below the 90-degree mark. So again, you could definitely go lower than this, because essentially what we're looking for is to lengthen the glutes here. And to lengthen the glutes, we're going to have to aim to squat down to that 90-degree mark. No, you don't need to go bum to the floor, because again, that may shift emphasis away from the glutes and maybe more onto the quads, but you do want to try and get as low as you can within the glutes active range of motion, which is, like I said, usually around the 90-degree mark. Doing things like pulses and whatnot, I think, sure, if you have no equipment, I feel like maybe a time and a place, but realistically, they're not something I would typically include if you had access to additional resistance, because again, I just don't think you need to include them. That being said, as I mentioned earlier, if you are limited to equipment, it may be a bit trickier, because again, you don't have the ability to push the resistance too high. And doing movements where you're maybe emphasizing the pause position at the bottom of each squat might be better suited. So for this, I wouldn't necessarily go through a squat pulse, perhaps. I would instead maybe do a long duration pause where you're going down to the end of the glutes active range of motion, being, like I said, around the 90-degree mark, and aiming to hold that position for a period of time, let's say 15, 30 seconds, before then finishing the rest of the squat and treating that as a single rep, and maybe do a few of those. Because again, isometric movements, so movements where you're essentially holding tension without range of motion, do definitely have a time and a place, and I think at home no equipment workouts are probably one of the best times to implement such things. Probably not something I would prefer myself, but you can certainly do them. Is this abduction going to be necessarily relevant to the glutes, or is this more a means of just making it feel like it's burning and hurting a bit more than it perhaps should be? See, this is good. This is good. Implementing things and utilizing things like chairs, the stairs, whatever it may be, to allow you to perform different movements is definitely a big yes from me. So here, obviously, we're looking at doing a hip thrust, and the hip thrust, a fantastic movement to work the glutes in their shortened position. So we've got a squat variation for the lengthened position and a hip thrust for the shortened position. Two pretty effective glute movements right there, and you don't really need to do a mass amount on top of that. What I would probably do is make sure you're doing both of those movements to sufficient intensity, and also make sure you're doing enough of each of those movements. The big thing here is trying to avoid that tilt back. See her, she's kind of shifting that weight back and the shins are no longer vertical. We don't need to go that low. We're trying to maintain vertical shins for as long as possible, so again, you don't need to push back too far. What I would probably do if you're able to and want to make this movement harder is you can do unilateral, so one leg at a time, which again is shifting that weight all onto one side, and then add in an additional pause at the top of each rep, so you're holding that shortened position at the peak contraction for 5, 10, 15 seconds, or something similar, to then enhance the difficulty of that movement because you aren't able to progressively overload it with resistance. But what you could do is focus on progressive overload with additional reps, whilst also thinking about how you can make that movement harder as well. A courtesy lunge, again, I think it is fine. You can certainly do it. Again, I don't know if I'd favor it though. I think I'd probably opt for something like a split squat, which I think is fantastic, and you can definitely do that at home, obviously utilizing the chair as a means of elevation, or maybe even a walking lunge. Both of them are going to be very effective for the glutes, unilateral movement as well, so again, it makes it a bit harder because you're shifting all of that weight onto one side at a time. It's also a bit fun and a bit spicy where you're not just stuck in one place. You are, especially with the walking lunge, able to move around. But that being said, if you are limited to things like room and space, then a split squat is just as good, despite the fact that it will probably make you want to question your life and question every choice you've ever made. And despite you believing you may be a good person, the split squats will make sure you don't believe that anymore. So this is actually the movement I really wanted to talk about, which is essentially a weightless glute kickback. This is probably my least favorite movement of the bunch, because again, how much resistance are you really getting with a weightless kickback? Probably not a lot, to be honest. At least with a squat, you're getting a good amount of your body weight being thrown into there, and the lunges, etc., etc. But with the kickback, again, you are not really getting a lot beyond simply just contracting the muscle without it really achieving much. So sure, I get the implementation of this for the sake of novel exercises and doing something a bit different and a bit new, but I don't think you need to. I think I'd actually just choose 3 good movements and just do more of them, which I get is a bit boring and I get isn't as fun and fancy, but it is probably going to be more effective. Very quick announcement, as always, TFNL group coaching is obviously linked down below in the description and probably the comment section as well, in which I structure training programs for people to follow both at home and at the gym, and you can follow it together as part of the team, or you can do it on your own if you want to. There's a message board in there so we can all talk. You can comment on sessions as well. Tell me what you like, tell me what you don't like, tell me what you want to see next time, all these bits and bobs. So it's very exciting and it likely costs less than your Netflix subscription. And we're actually due to start a new training program on Monday the 20th of March, which is either today, depending on when this video comes out. And obviously, as always, the TFNL growth guide is linked down below in the description as well. And we're also in the process of releasing the home workout add-on to the growth guide, which is going to be released very soon. And then again, we go into this kind of side-to-side lunge variation. Again, sure, I think fine, technically a fine movement when considering being at home with no equipment. Again, if you had equipment, then I'd probably say no thank you. But the fact that you have no equipment, I would say I'm a bit more lenient and a bit more understanding. I just don't think you need to do it necessarily. I think you probably get just as good a benefit just choosing 3 or so good movements and doing more of them. What's really going to matter here, and this is something I will preach all the time, regardless of your goals, what's really going to matter is making sure you are doing whatever you are choosing to do, be that the best movements in the world or the worst movements in the world, do them with sufficient intensity. You can do this workout with no intensity and you're not going to achieve a lot. If you do this workout, despite whether I think it's the best or the worst, if you do it with sufficient intensity, i.e. you're training to, if not close to failure, and I mean proper failure, not that failure where you feel like you're done, but you're actually just a bit sore. I mean the failure where you can't actually do any more with good technique, then you will see results. I think there's this big pressure being placed on like, oh, you've got to do this movement or you can't do this movement, when in reality, I don't necessarily think most people need to worry too much about what movements they're choosing to do until they can train with sufficient intensity. Because as I mentioned, you could do the best movement in the world with awful intensity or the worst movement in the world with amazing intensity, and you are likely going to experience better results doing the worst movement in the world with good intensity, because intensity is such a driving factor of the development of muscle, so building muscle. And be that if you want to look a bit more toned, be that if you want to just build muscle to get bigger, be that wanting to get stronger, whatever it may be, intensity is a big factor and a big variable to consider regardless of your goals. The one thing that is really hard with home workouts, and this is not MadFit's fault, this is just across the board, is that it's really hard to effectively target the hamstrings without having any equipment. Realistically, you are kind of limited to doing something like a leg slide, like a towel slide on the floor, where you're essentially doing like a leg curl variation using the towel to slide your heels to your bum. But beyond that, you're actually quite limited, because again, you can do RDL variations, but without resistance, they're not going to be massively effective. You're essentially just stretching. So although I do understand that a lot of people don't have access to resistance and don't have access to equipment, I would always say if you're able to, I would strongly recommend investing in something like bands, perhaps, dumbbells, something where you are adding additional resistance. I'd arguably probably suggest bands to start with, because you can probably get more bands with a greater resistance range for your money than you would dumbbells, because dumbbells can get quite expensive. If you can, try and tickle and pick up some used, new, whatever it may be, bands to then add to these movements to at least give you a means of tracking resistance-based progressive overload rather than merely rep-based progressive overload. Because again, whether you're working out at home or you're working out in the gym, whatever it may be, progressive overload is very important. And I think there's this big pressure on creators to create these fancy, cool workouts with loads of different variations. But in doing so, although it's more marketable and looks a bit cooler and a bit nicer, it's arguably less effective. I'd probably just choose 3 solid movements and just do them really well. So I'd probably look at like a squat, like I mentioned earlier. I look at a hip thrust variation, be that bilateral, being both legs at the same time, or unilateral, being one leg at the same time. And I look at a unilateral kind of lunge or squat pattern, like a split squat or a lunge. And to be honest, I think if you've done that, again, with the consideration of no equipment, you've probably done enough, provided, like I said, you are training hard enough. I know it's not fancy, I know it's not exciting, but sadly, effective training often isn't that exciting. But what it does need to be is sustainable. because you can do the best things in the world, but if you can't stick to it, you're going to limit how much you can progress. So if you can stick to it, you're probably going to see some solid results provided intensity and other variables have been checked. And then again, to make movements a bit harder when you are limited to equipment, identify the point of peak tension in that movement and spend a bit more time there. So for example, with the squats, the point of peak tension there will be the bottom position, so the lengthened position. So pause at that bottom position, hold that for 5, 10, 15 seconds, whatever it may be, and then explode up. With a hip thrust, for example, the peak tension there is going to be the shortened position, so the top where you're most contracted. So hold that position for 5, 10, 15 seconds, whatever it may be. So you're almost identifying the most important point of that range of motion and spending more time there, just to try and milk it for all it's worth if you are a bit limited to equipment. So again, those are just simply my suggestions. You don't need to do a lot of volume. If you're only choosing 3 movements, I think doing anywhere from, let's say, 2 to 3 sets would probably be plenty. Provided you're moving well, intensity is going to be key. So really try and push yourself and really train hard, which I know is easier said than done, but it's a skill that many people take some time to learn. But once you've learned it, it's something that's going to help carry you much further along your fitness journey. But now that's done, we're actually going to quickly talk about comment question of the week. Why do some women have butt folds, but others don't? This varies from person to person, whether they are well trained or not, but I just want to understand why is that. So I'm unsure what a butt fold might be, but I'm assuming it's maybe like an aesthetic or visual aspect of somebody's body that isn't necessarily consistent amongst everybody. And that's largely, again, provided my assumption is correct, going to be based on genetics. It's going to be based on how quickly you respond to muscle gain in certain areas. It's also going to be based on where you store fat. So fat distribution, again, being largely genetic, which is something we can't change, is very much going to contribute to the shape of our body and to these things that may fall into the realm of butt folds, because again, it's just how your body is storing fat and where it's storing fat, and also where it's losing fat first, where it's gaining fat first. I would say my answer here, provided I've understood this correctly, is probably going to be genetics, essentially. But that is it. That is the video. Thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for tolerating the fact that I tried so desperately hard not to get distracted by the dog today, and I succeeded. And thank you for tolerating the video.